So thank you to everyone for joining us back here at White One Auto. And during our question and answer section, we have a question that was submitted by Larry Lewis. And I'll read the question. Good morning, White One Auto. Have a 2011 Chevy Impala blowing white smoke from the exhaust. Had high oil level past the dipstick mark. No milky color. A matter of fact, the oil looks black, even though the customer said they had it changed 2 weeks ago. The coolant reservoir is empty. The vehicle starts up and runs for a few seconds, then dies when pressing the accelerator. Then, white smoke comes in a puff. Lowered the engine oil level, pulled the front spark plugs, and see the plugs are dry with minimum exhaust burn. Suspect low compression in one of the cylinders. Is it a possible head gasket, head itself? Okay, so thank you for submitting your question, and let's look at the facts where we have here. The number one fact that I would say I'm concerned about here is that the cooling system reservoir is empty, I believe. Or did you say low? Let me see. Was it empty or low? Yeah, you said empty. So first off, I want to find out why that cooling system reservoir is empty. I know a lot of times white smoke can indicate coolant entering the combustion chamber and being burned, and that's why you see the white smoke out of the exhaust. But right now, it's still winter time, so pretty much most cars are going to be putting out some white smoke out of the exhaust when it's very cold outside. So I'm not as concerned with the white smoke. First I want to figure out where that the coolant is going from the coolant reservoir. So you said it's 2011 Chevy Impala. I'm sure it's got a V6 in it because I don't believe a 4-cylinder was offered until the new body style 2014 models. And they still made the old body style and the new body style both from 14. So this is 11, so it's got to have a V6 in it. It's probably a 3.6 or a 3.5. So to figure out where that coolant is going from the reservoir, first I would pressure test the cooling system. The way you do that is I use a pressure tester. This one is from Snap-on. The part number of it is SVTS272. The way this works is you wait till your cooling system is cold, because you never want to remove a cooling system cap or cooling system components while they are hot, because the cooling system is pressurized to raise the boiling temperature. So when it's pressurized, if you open it, it'll shoot that fluid out, and when it's pressurized and hot, that's hot fluid that's being shot out, and it will burn it. So this cap right here, which is threaded on, would go into your cooling system for your 2000 Chevy Impala. You would remove your cap when it's cold, screw this on, and then you would attach this adapter to your cap and pump it up. So what you want to do is look at the PSI rating on your cap and duplicate that same rating with this. You don't really want to go much higher because you could potentially cause a problem. So what this will allow you to do is check for internal and external leaks. So you are going to have to add some cooling to your cooling system. And like I said, it is winter time, so I would not recommend you adding just water to it, because you or the customer may forget that it just has water in it. And if it's just water in it and it sits outside and it freezes, you're probably definitely gonna have a cooling system, a cracked head or a cracked block. So I would add the correct type of cooling system, of coolant to it, and then attach my pressure tester and pump it up to the correct pressure. Now, I am going to look externally for leaks, because if I find an external leak, that gives me one clue as to where our coolant should be going, because cars should not use coolant. If you have a coolant leak, something is wrong. You need to figure it out, and you know that. That's why you're asking your question. So first off, I would look externally. I would look at all my hoses, my radiator. I would look at my water pump, see do I see any kind of leakage there. If I don't see any external leaks, now I turn my attention internally. And what you would do internally, you could check, is you could pull the spark plugs out and see, are they wet? You can stick a borescope down the cylinders and see, do you see any type of coolant inside of the cylinders? The coolant for that car should be orange, so it should be readily able to be seen. You also asked about a cracked cylinder head. Now, the only way I have seen like a cracked cylinder head while the engine is still assembled is I have seen them actually crack where the bolt goes through the cylinder head and you can see coolage, leakage, or seepage around there. So the way you would have to check for that is pull a valve cover off, then keep the cooling system pressurized and make sure it has the correct amount of coolant, and check all around the area where your valve cover was and see, do you see any coolant there? Because if you're seeing coolant there, you could have a porous head, you could have coolant wicking up a bolt, but either way, the head is gonna have to come off if you see coolant there. And if you do pull that head off, I always recommend you take it to a machine shop and have it thoroughly checked to make sure you know where all of the cracks are, and is the head repairable or do you just need a replacement? So if the cylinder head now passes your crack check, you want to have that surface resurfaced, get you new bolts if they're torque to yield bolts, and a new head gasket. There are times in manufacturers that make a shim head gasket to accommodate for if you've had that head resurfaced. Now, since we are dealing with a V6, even though you have your head, if you did find a cracked cylinder head or a cracked or a failed head gasket, you are going to want to remove both cylinder heads on a V8 engine because it runs in a V and your intake manifold bolts down on there. So you need to have the same amount of material removed from both cylinder heads so your intake manifold will see correctly. And you want to move the bare amount possible. Also, I know a lot of manufacturers do make a shim head gasket that is actually thicker so you can compensate for the material that was moved from the cylinder head. So your push rods and your timing chains, if it's an overhead cam, so everything stays in the correct order. Because when you change one thing, it does affect something else. So that's why you want to be certain that you actually have a failure in that head gasket or head area before you just go ripping stuff off. So where were we at? So we were at our pressure test. So you got this thing, you've let it cool down, you have added the correct amount of coolant because this thing was empty, you pressure tested. We're taking our borescope, we're looking down each cylinder, seeing do we see coolant there. I really wouldn't recommend pulling a valve cover off unless you're pretty much certain that you do have a cracked cylinder head, but I wouldn't go that far yet. Another way you can check to see if you have combustion gases getting inside your cooling system, either a failed head gasket or a cracked cylinder head or a cracked block, excuse me. I apologize, my battery died while we were talking, but I think I was at the combustion gas tester. So what we'll do. So the way this works is it takes a special fluid. That fluid is designed to react at the presence of exhaust gases. So what you do is you wait till your cooling system is cooled off and safe to take your radiator cap off. Make sure it's filled at the correct level. So you add this coolant to this apparatus right here. And then now you want to start up your vehicle. But you do not want this apparatus touching the coolant or submerged in the coolant. You want it above the coolant so it can inhale the fumes that are going to cook off the coolant as it starts to heat up. So as you start getting those fumes, you pump this ball right here kind of like a blood pressure cup, and it draws the fumes through it. And if there are exhaust gases in those fumes, it will react with the fluid. The fluid will change color from blue to yellow, and you know you have combustion gases in your cooling system, so you have a problem. So we have talked about combustion gas, the pressure tester, how you would look down in the cylinder, check for internal leaks. Another check you can do is they do make fluorescent dye specifically designed for coolant. This dye right here is designed for oil-based products, not coolant, but they do make a fluorescent dye for that, where you can add the fluorescent dye to your cooling system when it's cold, and then take the vehicle for a drive as long as it's not severely overheating. I would add, and then you would come back in and check and see, is that dye any place else? Because if the cooling system is sealed, that dye should only remain in your coolant and it shouldn't track over to your oil. But one other thing you want to be mindful of is you need to know if anyone has added a fluorescent dye to the engine oil possibly before, because they may have been looking for an oil leak. And also, sometimes a lot of vehicles have engine oil coolers, where you could have an engine oil cooler that is attached to the radiator, and that could fail, or an engine oil cooler on the engine, and that could fail because it'll have coolant going through it, and that's another way coolant and oil could mix. So you need to be very aware of how the vehicle you are diagnosing, what all the components of the coolant system and the lubrication system are. So another way you can test is, you said you suspected low compression. There's a very easy way to tell if you do have low compression, is you use a compression tester set. This one is from Snap-on. It's EEPV 500. And the way this thing works is first of all, you want to disable your ignition and fuel system, because you're going to crank the engine over and you do not want it to start. So once you figure out a way to disable your ignition and fuel system, you pull a spark plug out, and then you screw in the appropriate adapter where these threads match your spark plug threads. You just screw them in by hand. It's got a little rubber O-ring down here. And then once that's screwed in, you attach this gauge. It's just a quick disconnect. You attach it, and then you want to make sure you have a fully powered battery, because what you're going to do is go inside the vehicle and crank it over, say for 15 seconds. And then you are going to record your reading. Normally, anything over 120 is good for a worn engine. I don't know how many miles is on your engine, but if you get over 120, 100, you are probably fine. But the number one thing you are checking for is, on a compression test, is you want to make sure all the cylinders are within 10% of one another. So if you had one cylinder at 100, and then you have another cylinder at 150, you know we have a problem, because your highest cylinder is 150. So to be within 10% of that, plus or minus 10%, you would either be at 165 or 135. It's 10% of 150 is 15, so 15 plus 150 is 165, and 150 minus 15 is 135. I think I didn't say 150, but I hope you know I meant 150 plus 15 is 165, and 150 minus 15 is 135. So if you were checking an engine and your highest cylinder was at 150 and all of the rest of them were around 135, 140, 160, you would be within range. What that means is that the cylinder, the wear and the condition of the engine is pretty much standard, is the same across the board. Now, if you want to take that even further, you would then do a cylinder leakage test. And the way you do a cylinder leakage test, let me grab the gauge. So, this cylinder leakage test is from Snap-on. The part number of this is EEPV 509. And the way this works is, first of all, to do a cylinder leakage test, you have to bring your cylinder on top dead center compression stroke, because you want both of the valves to be closed, because what you're going to do is now you are going to add air to the cylinder, you are going to air it up by 1 gauge and then watch how fast it drops off. And it gives you like a red, like from 100% to 0%. So somewhere in the 20s is typically good for an engine, and you probably, that's probably what you're gonna see. But while that cylinder is aired up and it's on compression stroke with both valves closed, you can listen if you're seeing leakage and determine where the air is going. So if you're seeing a leakage and you can open your throttle blade and see, do you hear the air coming out of the throttle? Because that would either indicate you have an intake valve problem or you're not on top dead center. So you probably want to verify if you are seeing leakage through the intake system or through the exhaust system that you are on top dead center. Probably one of the easiest ways to make sure you're on top dead center is to pull that valve cover off and watch the rocker arms as they close. If you see them, so it goes intake, compression, exhaust, you want to watch them, and then once your intake exhaust stroke is done, that intake valve should close, and then the piston should keep traveling up, and then your exhaust valve should remain closed. So if that piston is traveling up and your exhaust valve is opening, you're on the exhaust stroke because it's pushing the exhaust out. So you want to make sure you're on the compression stroke, so you can check to see if you're certain you're on compression and you're getting high leakage on your cylinder leakage test. Open that throttle blade, see, do you hear air coming out of there? If you don't hear air come out of there, listen out of your exhaust. See, do you hear air coming out of there? If you did have a cooling system problem, you would open that coolant cap and see, do you see bubbles in your cooling system? Because the air could be going there. You would also pull your dipstick out and see, do you hear air there? Because the air could be seeping past the rings too much, and you could have air inside your oiling system. So those are some of the ways you can confirm if your compression is low and why it is low. Because it's one thing to know that it's low, but you also want to know why it's low so you can give that to your customer. And also, you want to figure out where that coolant is going. Is that coolant externally leaking or is it internally leaking? And then once you've figured out those two things, I think then you can figure out your performance problem as to why it's dying when you accelerate. So I hope that answered your question. Please continue to ask. Thank you very much for watching. White One Auto out.